And we should be live for all 0 of you who are actually watching right now. Hello. Probably take a minute to actually get some questions going, but if you have any questions, let me know. How are things going? Good. Hey, I'm here. Hi. Hello to everybody who is joining. It's been a while. It's been a busy week. So just a quick update for all of you who are joining now. I finally got to starting the podcast. So there are 5 episodes, 4 of which have guests, which are recorded and are ready to go up pretty much whenever. And there's very little for me to do. I just have to finish some editing, and those will go live. And those podcast episodes are going to be on both iTunes and YouTube. Talk about Datura. What aspect of Datura? Love the work you do. Thank you. What is drugs? Well, I believe sugar. I believe that's what drugs is. Not sure though. I don't know too much. Would taking 1 milligram of atezolizumab before cannabis reduce tachycardia caused by the cannabis? Yeah, it's definitely possible. A lot of the tachycardia coming from cannabis is not induced in a unavoidable pharmacological way. A lot of it has to do with sort of anxiety and panic provoked. So it is possible that atezolizumab could be good. I've personally, I believe, had my heart rate go higher on cannabis than basically any other drug, but it's a very inconsistent effect because it depends on the experience itself. Why is Salvinorin A considered an atypical psychedelic? Well, first, it doesn't actually provide the same effects as your average psychedelic. It really has. I wouldn't say it's best called a psychedelic. It really is dissociative, and it has some psychedelic-ish qualities, but it also functions in a way that is distinctly different from dissociatives and from psychedelics. So it kind of formed its own unique category. Talk about how much you want to do Datura. Well, it's kind of higher on my list than any other drug, I would say. Can MDMA make you psychotic? No. Of course, probably going to find one case report out there where somebody actually did become at least acutely psychotic. And I would say, yeah, acutely psychotic, sure, you take enough, delirium, confusion, hallucinations, aggression, that seems reasonable. Actually causing a psychotic disorder, not so much. Seth, why are you so interested in drugs? I would say I can't really find something to be more interested in outside of religion and spirituality and philosophy. But drugs are just cool. Now, the reason they're cool for me is because they have a strong historical connection that allows you to, it gives you a framework within which to view a lot of historical topics. You could talk about wars, you could talk about government exploitation of populations, you could talk about chemical warfare, you could talk about witches, you could talk about the origins of religious and spiritual practices and medicinal practices and even extant practices in places like South America. And then on the side of effects and pharmacology, these are some of the best tools for insight into how the drug or how the brain works. And I think the development of ideas about how the brain works has really gone hand in hand with the discovery of how drugs work. Did you hear about the Alpha Bay incident? Yes, I did, and I saw an update more recently which was saying it appears as though it was actually a law enforcement operation for shutting it down, not a exit scam. And by the way, sort of in this general topic area, one of the people I want to have on the podcast is either the mother or sister of Ross Ulbricht, the founder of Silk Road. I think that'd be a good discussion. Talk about prohibition and the abuses of law enforcement and the justice system due to prohibition. Because I don't care who you are, I don't care if you think that drugs should definitely be illegal. What happened to Ross Ulbricht is absurd. Setting aside the issues with his case, which suggests significant corruption and highly misleading information, even if he did exactly what people said, and he was responsible for the site the entire time, and he should be treated as sort of a drug dealer, it's a ridiculous situation. But yeah, as for Alpha Bay, I'm at least somewhat aware. Is salvia dangerous? Well, physically, no, for the most part. I mean, having tachycardia, sweating, maybe. I mean, there's not too much else it's going to do. And there's little indication that it's a significant seizure risk. So, no, physically, not really. Given the hallucinogenic effects, you have to treat it like other hallucinogens and consider your emotional state and your psychological state before using it. And obviously, if you're using full blast off doses every day, who knows, you might end up in a sort of interesting psychological state. Is it possible to see if you got real acid without a test kit? No, not really. And even a test kit is not going to perfectly tell you if you got LSD. It's primarily going to tell you you probably did not get something that would hurt you. And that's good. I mean, that's useful. It's going to rule out things like, or effectively rule out things like the DOX class and 25I NBOMe. However, I would say everybody should be using Ehrlich. That's important. If you don't have access and you are insistent on using a tab of what is allegedly LSD, then you should definitely pay attention to two things: whether it numbs your tongue or mouth, and also if you notice uh, a very bitter taste. So you can have some taste to some degree from actual LSD tabs, but if it is very bitter to the point of having you actually are disgusted to some degree by the taste, that might be a sign, or that is a sign. If you have not tested it, that's a reason to just take it out and get rid of it. Scopolamine, talk about it. What aspect? It's a interesting hallucinogenic, deliriant, anticholinergic, which Vice probably overstated the interesting South American aspects, but it's a cool drug. People have been using it for centuries, along with the other hyoscyamine and atropine. Does Datura always cause a terror, panic, demonic trip, or is it overblown? Well, I would say if you're saying it is demonic, as in you're being possessed by a demon, I don't think that's what you meant, but just having fun with it. No, I would say that's not legit. However, for the other qualities, I would say no, you're not always going to have a severely negative experience. In fact, some people have even had just interesting or moderately positive experiences. But confusion and delirious hallucinations are a key part of the effects, and therefore I don't think you can take the drug safely without somebody helping you and watching over you. And it's worth noting that even the tribes and or ethnic groups in, say, South America or upper Central America, Southern North America, who have used datura plants and tropane alkaloid plants, have not treated them as though they are necessarily positive. They often have some sort of negative connotation, even though they have found a ethnopharmacological use. So that tells you a bit. So if people are saying for centuries that it has a fairly prominent negative or confusing quality to it, that's what you should expect. Can psychoactive substances be bought from China with relative safety? It's really going to depend on what substance you're buying. Would using DCK, deschloroketamine, more than once a week be harmful at all? Well, we have really no clue. Obviously, the antimicrobial properties are interesting if they exist. I really want to stress the point that DCK has no verified antimicrobial properties, antibiotic, antifungal, antiviral, and therefore gut microbiome disruption and things of that sort. We have no clue. And at sufficient concentrations, you can even see antimicrobial. And this is according to studies, not just patents. You can see those qualities from ketamine. Now, I don't know that the concentrations are relevant for ketamine. However, the potential for something with that chemical structure to have something along those lines for antimicrobial seems within the realm of possibility. But we don't know. And the fact that these, I mean, if you look at those CT scans, CAT scans, if you look at those and see, say, on the toxoplasmosis situation, I think it was only a few administrations, basically, of the drug, according to the patent. And if those effects are real, then I think that's pretty significant, and it would be interesting to see why nobody has followed up if those are legitimate properties. So yeah, I would say don't use it more than once a week because of it being a research chemical, but really not for any other reason. And also, you're probably best off not taking dissociatives more than once a week, if you can. Seth, again, man, love your videos. Please keep it up. When I can, I will donate. Well, thank you ahead of time for the donation. I really appreciate it. With constant adding of chemicals to the Controlled Substances Act, is it starting to make it unenforceable? Well, I would say it's already effectively unenforceable in terms of, well, I shouldn't say unenforceable. I would say it's not really enforced for the schedules entirely. So say modafinil is scheduled, but is it really enforced to any notable degree? No, not too much. Compared to, say, Schedule 1 or Schedule 2. And if you were to add a ton of research chemicals, and they do add a lot, then that would only add to the situation for making it somewhat difficult to pay attention. I mean, I don't know how much that impacts enforcement, them choosing or not to enforce certain policies or pursue certain leads when they find out that somebody has, say, ordered a certain drug, a large quantity of a certain drug. That sort of thing exists, being biased towards heroin over modafinil, but being unenforceable, I'm not sure that would necessarily develop. What's your take on PCP? I would say you have to be a little more careful with it than ketamine or MXC. But beyond that, I would not say the stereotypical effects of running into the street naked and you just killed somebody and now you're flipping over a car. No. Is there any validity? There we go. To the whole trend of microdosing LSD, psilocybin, because I would think the tolerance would deter all effects. Typically, microdosing is recommended for like 2 times per week. It doesn't seem, if it is doing something, it doesn't seem totally unreasonable that tolerance would not get in the way. But obviously, we do not have good studies to actually say microdosing is doing anything. And if a microdose, as Jim Fadiman says, is a dose that you are not overtly noticing, and if anything, you're more reflectively noticing after the day is done, I think there's so much room for that to be placebo. There was actually, I think I might do a video on this. There was actually a paper recently which looked at giving placebo to, I still have to read it, but placebo to healthy college-aged students. And although their cognitive performance did not improve, I believe the finding was that their perception of their own cognitive performance improved. And it's a good example of just what we already know, which is that under the influence of placebo, and therefore most probably nootropic reports, you're experiencing something that doesn't actually have a pharmacological basis and is based upon expectancy and other people's reports, not based upon drug interacting with a receptor leading to X effect. You hear about SI? Yes, I have. What would you say the worst drug available is? I could give you the stereotypical drug reformer position and say alcohol, but I don't really believe that. I would always say deliriants. I always go for deliriants. I would say a drug with a low safety ratio is ultimately going to be worst. And an example of that may be, say, bromo dragonfly, which is fairly close. At least we don't have good enough dosing information to say this dose is reliably safe. Even for 25I, we can fairly reliably say that 500 micrograms will give you a moderate effect and not kill you in almost every case. So it doesn't concern me as much. Bromo dragonfly has extra concerns. I'd have to actually sit down and really go through a whole list of substances to find what I would say is the worst drug. If we're talking about more common substances, heavy alcohol use is definitely a concern and legitimately can be neurotoxic. You can, to some extent, avoid that through thiamine. And yeah, I mean, it all depends on how you use it. For any drug, methamphetamine, cocaine, heroin, etc., it all depends on the dose, the environment, other factors. Are you sleeping? You know, in the case of, say, methamphetamine, are you actually sleeping? Are you actually eating? Things of that sort. I mean, it can be as simple as that when it comes to safety. Thank you, by the way, for the $2 support. I really appreciate it. Talk about methaqualone. Well, I am currently researching methaqualone for an overview. I've gotten really sidetracked in the past few days or past week because of the podcast, which is a good thing. I'm glad I finally have podcast episodes coming up. But methaqualone, it will be the next drug overview. I think it's a very interesting substance. I think if you're expecting Wolf of Wall Street type effects, then you're probably not looking in the right place. But it's an interesting sedative. I find what's interesting are the overdose effects, which seem to be atypical, such as uh, hypertonia, so increased muscle tone, increased seizure capacity or likelihood, and still coupled with unconsciousness, so that's a typical effect. But impaired respiration is not as common. So there's something going on, and I think there's one good pharmacology study for methaqualone from 2015, and I think if I'm interpreting it correctly, we could possibly justify these atypical overdose effects, and I'm talking about significant overdoses. It'll continue to be a significant depressant, typical depressant, for quite a while before you reach these atypical effects. And there'd be no reason to take atypical doses. And I think the reason for some of those effects might be that there's a reflux, a reverse action at the GABA A complex that occurs, leading to a opposite flow. So you're actually changing neuronal activity to excitatory, potentially, through kind of a unique mechanism. But it's totally hypothetical. Anyways, I know most people have heard of methaqualone or Quaaludes due to, say, Wolf of Wall Street and Hunter S. Thompson or somebody. A lot of the lore surrounding it is not too legit. Personally, I have been advocating for the legalization of medical crack, thinking this is slightly a joke. Maybe not. Who knows? Maybe you're trying to use cocaine in place of methylphenidate or something. Do you personally have any experience with this wonderful substance? I haven't tried cocaine, so I haven't tried inhaling cocaine either. What's with this recent microdosing BS, anyways? I think people are just interested in the idea of using a substance, say LSD, that people think is this incredibly interesting substance, an incredibly powerful substance, and using it on a regular basis to improve cognitive performance. I think it's just an interesting idea, even if it's not legit. So there's enough that people know about LSD to be interested in the substance and interested in alternative ways of using it. Are they ever going to make an official decision about kratom, or are they just going to let it stay legal? I am totally not sure. I'm not inside the heart of the DEA and those who otherwise give input, like the FDA, and so I'm not sure. Considering it's been many months since we've heard anything about it, I'm not sure they're moving towards I don't think they're moving towards emergency scheduling. Maybe they're trying to gather evidence to justify permanent scheduling. But there was a lot of backlash, and you haven't seen that for most substances. And who knows, maybe there was actually behind the scenes talk that finally got them to realize that perhaps making it harder to get an opioid, which is safer and could be a substitute for heroin during a supposed heroin epidemic, is not the best idea. But that would be assuming there's people in the government who think about harm reduction. And who knows if that's been ever the case. Has HPPD been cured? Well, not in terms of there actually being a specific cure. A lot of people find benzodiazepines work well, and some anti-seizure medications work well. I'm blanking on the name of one of them, which has shown... One second. I'll pull up my page on it. Yeah, it can be cured for some people through medication, through stress reduction, through paying less attention to it, and sometimes just waiting 6 or 12 months. But it's going to bug me if I don't actually look at the substance. Lamotrigine. There we go. And levetiracetam, Keppra. Those have worked in some cases, which really fits with the idea. And this is why LSD doesn't totally not concern me, or certain LSD experiences that are stressful and not planned out concern me, or high dose experiences, because there is some indication here, especially if you look at the research of David Abraham. Is it David Abraham? Or was it Henry? David Abraham. Henry David Abraham. There we go. If you look at his research, and I have no reason not to believe it, then there's some evidence of some sort of excitatory or lack of inhibitory activity in the thalamus, in the visual cortex, which we would classically say is a sign of toxicity. And I've personally experienced HPPD. I don't stop using psychedelics as such, and most of my symptoms have gone away due to stress reduction. But when I get really stressed, especially in certain environments, I can still have those symptoms, which is interesting. It's not actually impairing. Sometimes it's correlated, as is the case for a lot of people, with an increase in also psychological symptoms like dissociation, but my dissociation stems further back than HPPD, so who knows with that. But the point being that, hey, LSD is a drug, you should be treating it as such. There's one report on salvia curing HPPD for one person, but I don't know. Yeah, I'm not sure that that would be my go-to for trying to cure HPPD, but it is such a mix of, well, one, that's an anecdotal report, and treat it as such. But beyond that, there seemed to be some, aspect of, psychological activity. So who knows? Maybe you can cure it on a psychological level. What is the most addicting drug other than caffeine? Going by statistics. Okay, well, typically people end up saying heroin and nicotine. I would say I classify nicotine and caffeine, quote unquote, addiction differently than heroin and cocaine and methamphetamine addiction. I think this is an issue of terms to some degree. Now, if we're talking about addiction in a purely just habit way, and there's no other more interesting psychological thing going on, say avoiding trauma or trying to cure emotional issues, then sure, they're all habits. And if you go purely by habituation and how common habituation is, it is pretty common with caffeine and nicotine or tobacco in general and heroin. But most people who try any of those drugs do not end up at any given time using them in an addictive way. And also, I don't think that we should really be calling caffeine addictive in most cases. If we're going to use the term addictive, we should probably be, for the sake of simplicity, and I'll argue some of the podcasts are about addiction, and you'll hear my perspective and other people's perspective, including psychotherapists, more. But I could go on and on about my thoughts on addiction. But just to make it simple, let's go with DSM-5 classification, or the international classification. But DSM-5, let's just go by that for addiction, and therefore caffeine, in most cases, is not going to be addictive. So, there's that. Do you think you'll do a video on sugar? Would you classify that as the most addicting drug? Well, no, I wouldn't. To the second part, I don't like calling it a drug. I don't like calling food drugs. So macronutrients, I don't go around calling drugs. Obviously, it's not a perfect classification. It's really just terminology. There are physiological effects. There are even psychoactive effects, and you could say ketone bodies are a food source, and they clearly have psychoactive effects, including acutely. So there's that. But anyways, so as for the first part, yeah, I might cover sugar. It's a very big topic, and I don't know how soon I'll cover it. Maybe I'll talk about it in a podcast or some other format sooner. You should do more on-camera stuff. I probably will. At some point. Probably maybe after August. How long has it been since you experienced HPPD? Yeah, it's been, I'd say, probably a couple months since I experienced a flare-up of symptoms. I was more stressed, just going into personal stuff, just more stressed a while back than I am now. And so in the winter, I experienced some HPPD again. Again, it correlates with stress. Now I only have some visual snow. I never consider that a good enough. It could be coming from the same physiological process, but I don't consider that a real case of HPPD. Seth, you want to try DXM? Sure, I'll try DXM. What is HPPD? Oh, okay. Yes. Hallucinogen persisting perception disorder. I will put the link to my content in the chat. It's a disorder that can arise typically from psychedelics, and it involves at least perceptual changes that are akin to hallucinogenic effects, but also often psychological changes. And it can be impairing. It can make it difficult to read, to focus, to drive, etc. There's multiple kinds, and we don't know the prevalence. There's reason to think that HPPD is correlated with stress during an experience. Possibly. That's my It's partly my hypothesis, and I want to get Henry Abraham, who probably is the leading person on HPPD, on the podcast. And here is that link. If someone wanted to ruin your life, is your work a risk factor, i.e., are you an easier target to sue for health reasons? No, I don't think I'm an easier target to sue. Yeah, I'm not worried. Does cannabis help ADHD? I think it can for some people, but we don't have good evidence that it is a good treatment for most people. It's really going to depend on the person, on the dose, and I think we have enough other treatments for ADHD. Not enough, obviously, but I would go for those first. You should make a video talking about Hawaiian baby wood rose. Yeah, I'll cover LSA and the sources of it more. What is the safest deliriant? I would say you're better off going with diphenhydramine than trying to use Datura or Mandrake or Brugmansia. Not to say too much, though, about safety. Am I vegan? I was for a time. I'm not currently vegan. What is 3 FPM most similar to for effects? I would recommend, I think I have a 3 FPM video somewhere. I can say personally I found it to be relatively close to caffeine or a better caffeine, a more, yeah, just a better caffeine for wakefulness and for non-recreational stimulation in the absence of too much physical stimulation. It seemed to be a pretty good drug from that perspective. But I would recommend watching the video. I believe there is one. Oh, and as always, I recommend sending me an email if I don't get to your question. I can pretty much answer everything via email if I don't get to it on a stream. So feel free to contact me there. It is on the screen right now, seth@thedrugclassroom.com. And of course, if you want to support everything the Drug Classroom does, including the upcoming podcast, including all the videos and everything else, is only supported by donations. There's no ads or sponsors. So, your support is greatly appreciated. Can I use MDMA with Viagra, sildenafil? It's possible, and there's, interestingly enough, reason to think it could be good for reducing neurotoxicity. I don't immediately have, with common doses of either, significant concerns on a health basis, but I wouldn't also recommend it as totally safe. I honestly would have to look at the interaction more before giving a final, statement of use sildenafil as much as you want on MDMA. What should someone do if they have a dissociative experience from psychedelics? Do you mean having dissociation for a time on psychedelics or because of psychedelics lasting longer than the acute drug effect? Will you cover 3 MMC in a video soon? Yeah, it's on the list. I'll try to get to it. I forget what I said. I mean, I have methaqualone coming up. Oh, what was I going to cover after that? I think memantine might be next, which, if you're listening, Ben, that might be the one that I do next. I've heard LSA, or I'll just extend this to actually using Hawaiian Baby Wood Rose and Morning Glory, can be a very, very, or rather, unpleasant experience. Do you have any information about that? Yes, it can be negative. Some people find it's quite sedating, though that's not too negative. And some people find it is much more prone to causing significant nausea. I personally never experienced with either kind of plant nausea, and I did nothing beyond grind up the seeds. So I can't speak from experience on that, but some people definitely do experience nausea, and that would be a negative. Am I wrong, or is there an argument taking place about homeopathy in the chat? I haven't seen enough messages to actually know, but I would love to spout off on homeopathy if you want me to. And hint, I'm not a big fan. Thank you so much for considering memantine. It's actually a very interesting substance, so yeah, I do want to cover it. Are there drugs that can make you hungry? Well, cannabis sometimes makes people hungry. Beyond that, some people get increased hunger on benzodiazepines, though it's not necessarily the most typical effect. Um, yeah, I'm sure there's others. What is homeopathy? It is essentially taking a substance, diluting it to the point where you are having, for the sake of example, one molecule per, you know, the amount of water in the ocean on Earth. So, in other words, you're just drinking water. And supposedly, through some sort of quantum mechanism, you still get the effects. Now, the basis for homeopathy in, say, the 1800s was this idea that like cures like. So, if you have a disorder or a symptom and you find something else that causes the same symptom, meaning often negative things, negative substances, if you take a low enough amount, you can somehow cure the other thing that you already have. I would say this is a bad kind of medicine. Age of consent, my opinion. I have no desire to change it. I think it is a... There are nuances to the discussion, but 18 or whatever it is in your state seems reasonable. What's the difference between crystal MDMA and pill form? Well, if the crystal MDMAs are indeed MDMA and the pills are indeed MDMA and just filler, then nothing necessarily. So that's that. Otherwise, pills may be more likely to be an issue in terms of adulterants. But obviously, crystal, quote unquote, crystal MDMA can also just be other substances as well. So you got to reagent test in all cases. I would say if you have actual crystal powder MDMA, that's a little bit nicer for dosing. Has HPPD only been observed after LSD and not other drugs? No, it's actually been observed from multiple kinds of psychoactive substances. Occasionally MDMA, that's very rare though, overall. Mainly psychedelics, mainly LSD because of the sheer use, but psilocin and others as well, which makes sense. When can you do a video on Datura? Hopefully soon. I'll try. There's a lot of historical stuff to talk about for North America. Do you ever think the drinking age will be lowered to 18? I'm not sure that it will be, but I would like it to be. Is HPPD neurological damage? We don't know that it is damage, but it seems like there's some kind of dysfunction that can occur. Maybe. In some cases. But again, we don't have actually good evidence for this. I would say I pretty much tried to summarize everything we have in terms of research in my video and page for HPPD. So in terms of discussing mechanisms and what it might be for the affecting the primary visual cortex, affecting the lateral geniculate nucleus, for affecting other parts of the brain, I tried to discuss it. My opinion on religion. Well, there is an upcoming podcast episode where just for a period of time we talk about religion and spirituality. So you'll hear my thoughts there. And hopefully you'll like that podcast episode. It's about drugs for the most part, but also it gets into some philosophy. I am very interested in religion. I'm currently reading the Nag Hammadi scriptures. I was just reading the Gospel of Thomas the other day. I've been discussing Catholicism with somebody else and starting to read the actual Bible. I've read the Quran. I'm familiar with Buddhism, and I'm very interested in South American beliefs and Stoicism. Stoicism is the furthest from religion of those, however. I would say I grew up in a Jewish household, technically. I've done very little to actually look into the Old Testament or any other thing pertaining to Jewish practice, but it's interesting. I probably should at some point. I have been mainly focused on Christianity, and Islam, and Buddhism. It's very interesting. You know, if you want to hear my thoughts more, if you have any more specific questions about religion, I can try to give my thoughts. Have you read the Tibetan Book of the Dead? I have one. The Bardo Todol. I haven't read the entire thing, though. In fact, I haven't read the majority so far. You should collaborate with your mate Tom. It's very unlikely. Not to say anything negative about Tom. I've talked with Tom before, and I've corrected his mistakes before. Again, not negative. He's doing what he can. But, let's say a collaboration with Tom is more likely to occur than Drugs Lab. Is it true that SSRI drugs cancel out the effects of serotonergic psychedelics. As a general rule, if you've been on SSRIs, you'll have reduced response to LSD and classic psychedelics. For the most part, there's not a concern about serotonin syndrome. I did read some case reports where that seemed to be an issue with 25I, but 25I is not a classic psychedelic in terms of functionality as far as we know. I mean, I should rephrase. As far as we know, it primarily functions through 5-HT2A, but it could be affecting intracellular pathways to a greater or different degree. It's only been partly investigated, so who knows if there is some way in which you can get serotonin syndrome-like symptoms from some psychedelics combined with SSRIs. But if you're talking about LSD, psilocin, for the most part, that's not a concern, and it's mainly going to reduce the effects. Even though a lot of people do still report effects on SSRIs. Talk about your libertarian view. Again, this is like asking me to talk about what are your thoughts on Jesus or something, or Buddha. I've read a lot about libertarianism. It's where I lean. I lean in the direction of anarcho-capitalism. But I've further and further gone towards a more mainstream perspective. Being realistic, if somebody could say full civil libertarianism right now, combined with a welfare system that is made up of few benefits, however, it includes universal health care and basic income, I would make that switch. If we had full civil libertarianism and we had a restriction on taxes that brought us down to the lowest possible degree, including through limiting what the military spending is, I would have no issue with, say, limiting, for the sake of limiting taxes, I would have no issue with, I have a big issue with taxes for a number of reasons. And I would say limiting them as much as possible is nice. And I would say having it capped as a percentage in a even constitutional way outside of, say, a war or something, which, by the way, income tax used to be just implemented around wars. It took over 100 years to get a stable income tax. Tells us something about our country and how it has changed over time. Keeping in mind, I understand the country itself has changed. Anyways, okay, I'm just rambling about taxes at this point. However, yeah, I'm a libertarian in my general perspective of looking at things. It's the closest to my perspective. A video on steroids would be very nice. I will try to cover AAS and other, DNP and other interesting substances at some point. The problem is I'm not coming from a base of knowledge in the pharmacology to the same degree. So therefore I'd have to acquaint myself more with muscular physiology and endocrine physiology before I would feel comfortable doing videos. But I will, and maybe that will be discussed sooner on a podcast than in my normal content, just for the sake of being careful. Full liberty is a bad thing. Totally depends on what you mean by that. Full liberty in terms of you can kill people, yeah, I'm against that. Full liberty in terms of you can do whatever you want to your kids and treat them as badly as you want to, yeah, I'm against that. Full liberty in terms of you basically are never doing anything wrong until you hurt somebody else, I would debate on that. And again, that's recognizing, however, of course, that we are in a situation where morality is entirely, in many ways, not actually based on any kind of science or based upon actual facts. It's sort of arbitrary. So, hey, my political philosophy is arbitrary, and as are other political philosophies. But that's where I land for the most part. What types of drugs do you consider to be safe for recreational use? Most drugs can be safe recreationally. Hey Seth, do you think suicide is a human right? Uh, the only way in which this has a practical implication is regarding the policies surrounding assisted suicide and regarding the policies surrounding if you try to commit suicide on your own without a medical reason for doing so. And jail doesn't seem to make much sense in those situations. Am I going to add it to the Constitution or a Declaration of Human Rights? Probably not. It's a very unique thing. Suicide is a very unique thing from a philosophical perspective. I'll give you that. Yeah, as for policies, that's complicated. I've had a debate recently about assisted suicide, and, you know, it's a complicated topic. More likely to cause an overdose, stimulants or downers? Well, let's first define overdose. If you mean overdose in terms of death or a high potential for death, then depressants such as ethanol, such as opioids, are more of a concern than stimulants for death. If you mean just what overdose actually means, which is getting into the range at which the dose is leading disproportionately to negative effects, not necessarily fatal effects, then both have a pretty similar potential. Would there be any negative health effects of starting to vape, use e-liquid and e-cigarettes for nicotine administration, if you never used tobacco? I would say overall, nicotine is not going to be the safest drug to use over a lifetime. I think it might increase cancer risk, or at least other factors contributing to a carcinogenic potential aren't going to play nicely with nicotine. And say endocrine effects, estrogen effects, anti-estrogen effects in a negative way, even anti-estrogen effects for males in a negative way, and cardiovascular risk, they're still there. You're not going to die of lung cancer, most likely, but I would still caution against the daily heavy use of nicotine if you can avoid it. Opioids help with my mood disorder. Any thoughts? Well, opioids have been used for mood disorders for quite some time, and I think if it's taking place in the context of self-treatment, I would very much caution against it, and I recognize some people very much would prefer to be on, and I'm not even kidding, there are people who would much prefer to be on heroin for their depression if it works than to be on SSRIs. Whether that's justified or whether that's best for their life, I'm not sure in all cases. I recognize people feel that way in some instances, but I very much caution against using opioids for the purpose of a self treatment of an otherwise diagnosable medical disorder. I think you should be evaluated in a normal setting, even just due to the fact that you can often have your situation helped, alleviated, or at least, partly treated by psychotherapy and not from drugs. Unfortunately, you have to find a good psychotherapist. And unfortunately, at least as far as I know in the US, there is a drought, especially in rural and southern areas, when it comes to access to mental health care, which is remarkable and unfortunate. So if any of you are ever considering getting into the field of psychology, clinical psychology, or getting into the field of psychiatry, please do so, because we need more caring, good therapists out there than we have. And that's why I think a lot of people are really turned off of actually going to therapy, because the therapists are not always good. But that doesn't mean that you should avoid going. I'll be talking more about mood disorders, especially depression, in an upcoming episode with a psychiatrist, a fairly well-known psychiatrist who accepted my invitation. It's going to be maybe a month or two away, maybe a little bit longer, but it's coming up. Is microdosing as likely to cause HPPD? We have no actual data on this. I'm just going to say, sure. I'll say that's an educated guess that it might be a lower incidence. Have you done much research on the interaction between antipsychotics and classic psychedelics and the efficacy danger of this common suggestion? If you mean using antipsychotics, say haloperidol or Haldol, to end a trip from, say, LSD or psilocin, I would say it's typically not what emergency department doctors go for, and there might be a reason for that. Safety, physical safety, I'm not too concerned. In terms of actual efficacy, there's evidence for and there's potential evidence against. I would say there's almost no case in which I would recommend antipsychotics above or before using benzodiazepines. Benzodiazepines are easier to gain access to in many cases. They are fairly safe at common doses for combining with psychedelics to deal with the effects you're trying to counter, and they are the go-to for treating somebody in the ED. And whatever treatment is in the ED is probably a good idea of what to go by. And there's a lot more support, anecdotal support, for using them compared to antipsychotics. How safe is bufotenine? I would have to research it more to actually give a true opinion on bufotenine. I haven't researched it. I haven't done a video on it. So although I know about it and I know the effects overall ish, I really can't comment on safety. Did you go to college? And if so, what did you major in? I was enrolled in college and I started attending Penn State for international politics. That was in 2015. I left and I haven't gone back. I don't have any intention of going back. I prefer self-education in the areas related to drugs, and that is what I plan on doing. It's what I've been doing for a couple of years, and that's my plan. And if this doesn't work, I'll go and live in a monastery. Something like that. How harmful is it to get drunk? Not very harmful if you don't do it too much. How do you feel about the use of Xanax and Suboxone? If you mean together, then clarify. If you just mean using them in general, I don't really have an issue with buprenorphine being used for opioid addiction. I don't have an issue with alprazolam being used for certain psychiatric situations. What are you doing for a living? Where do you work at? I am increasing my work on the drug classroom, which is slowly but surely leading to a potential route of establishing a career in drug education. So that's my goal. Currently, however, I'm also working, and I have for many years, as a sort of a journalist covering technology and business. Totally different area. What is too much for alcohol? If you mean acutely, I would say don't go over 3 or 5 drinks. Probably no good reason to. If you mean chronically, or sort of how much in a week, I would say try to stay under, for long-term, best possible safety, try to stay under 7 drinks per week. How can I send you an email with a few questions? Use the email on the screen, seth@thedrugclassroom.com. What are benzodiazepines? Well, I've covered some already, but they are drugs operating effectively through a GABAergic mechanism, in a modulatory way, so increasing inhibitory activity in the brain, which can be useful for anxiety. It can be useful for seizures. It can be useful for multiple conditions. What is your opinion on kratom? There's a huge pushback happening currently to keep it legal. What's your stance? I've used kratom and I find it an interesting drug, albeit sometimes capable of causing vomiting, which is unfortunate. Setting that aside, it's a fine drug, and I think its safety is fairly high. Safety ratio is fairly high, or effective safety ratio is fairly high, and I have no real concern about it for most people in most situations. It definitely should not be prohibited. My favorite drug? Not sure. Not sure. Although somebody listening might know. Possibly. Who knows? Often my favorite drug keeps me up way too long. Just curious, is this how you're making your living? I kind of addressed that already. No, I'm not living on $300 a month. Uh, However, I do intend to try and I'll do my best to make this my full-time thing. That's why I'm expanding the drug classroom. I'm doing more videos. There's going to be more written content, and I have 4 podcast episodes already ready to go, and I'll start uploading those probably next week. So there's a lot I want to do with the drug classroom moving forward. And hey, if everybody helps out, then maybe it'll work. Does kratom really feel like an opiate? I would say we should be using the term opioid. It's just one of my things. And yeah, it can. I've tried common doses of kratom, and I've tried common doses of oxycodone, common recreational, not medical doses. And by far, kratom had more potential for recreational positive opioid effects. It's not purely an opioid, obviously. However, it's a very key part of its activity. Favorite drug is salvia. Oh, yeah, definitely salvia. Salvia has a tendency to yell at me. Not even kidding on that one. There's this recurring thing where on salvia I'm lectured basically by an sometimes unseen, invisible female entity. So that's always fun, you know. I would say my favorite drug might be 6-APB. Who knows? I haven't used it. I'm just assuming. Do you believe in audio, tantric, breathing techniques, or meditation can really be used to drug up? To drug up. I love that as an action. I'm gonna drug up now. If you mean just sort of get high or induce an altered state, sure. You can induce altered states through other means, including breathing, including meditation. Are you going to have LSD experiences from meditation? No. You can have interesting experiences, definitely. But I would say a lot of the things people promote as natural ways to get high are often kind of BS. Wait, you really haven't used 6-APB yet? I know, I know. I'm just assuming. I'm just assuming it seems like the right drug. Am I wrong? Who knows? And yeah, that's a great face. Are binaural beats BS? Probably not entirely. Maybe for like concentration. Maybe it helps in some way for concentration or something of that kind. Beyond that, I'm not sure. It's actually gonna do a whole lot. And if there are the so-called digital drugs or whatever people have called them, I would really say no. Do you think university college education is worth it these days? Oh, certainly. Depending on the field you're interested in, it's definitely still worth it. I just think a lot of people pursue fairly worthless degrees, but that definitely does not apply in all cases. And going the university track is makes tons of sense for tons of people. Thank you to the person who just donated 10. I really appreciate it. Do you think 1-PLSD is essentially as safe as LSD? I think we can effectively treat it as being as safe. Both we do not technically have, obviously, the evidence required to say 1-PLSD is as safe as LSD. But I would say, yeah, at common doses, there's little reason to think 1-PLSD is going to be more dangerous, and it probably has a high safety ratio just like LSD. Now, should you go around taking 20 tabs of 1-PLSD just to prove me wrong? Please don't. But I would say out of all the research chemicals, it doesn't concern me too much. What drugs do you recommend for a bipolar person? I recommend whatever drug is recommended by a psychiatrist treating the condition. Otherwise, whether you are talking about CNS depressants or stimulants, things which, depending on the state in which you're experiencing, can make you feel better. I can't deny that. I know self-medication, it could be cannabis, it could be heroin, it could be stimulants, can make you feel better. But in the case of bipolar, which is often a more serious psychiatric condition, please just don't mix them. I would rather see somebody be under the supervision of a psychologist, under the supervision of a psychiatrist, working on including good relationships in their lives and treating their condition, not trying to self-treat through drug use. Well, what's a drug that interests you but you would never actually do? I can't really point to one that really stands out, as I'm never going to do that. But if you can find me a drug which has a 1-1 safety ratio, it's going to interest me a lot, and I probably will not do it. Beyond that, hey, I'll probably never do BZ. It interests me a ton. BZ is a deliriant. It's classified as a chemical weapon. It's not deadly like sarin, but in fact, it's operating kind of opposite of sarin. But nevertheless, it's a chemical weapon, and I don't plan on having access to a chemical weapon anytime soon. And, you know, deliriants are a bit sketchy when it comes to your psychological safety. So, am I going to do BZ anytime soon? Probably not. That doesn't quite answer your question, but it's all I can offer. This is stream time, not BZ time. No, if it's stream time, it's BZ time. How much cannabis is too much? I would say the amount of cannabis that's too much is the point at which it's impairing your ability to do things that you want to do otherwise. And if you don't want to do anything otherwise, it's, you know, use as much as you want. I'm joking. It really, the thing is, there's no major physical toxicity. I just don't like seeing people replace all their other daily activities with cannabis or try to integrate cannabis into every aspect of their life. So, hey, if you can avoid that, try to do so. Thank you. I'll be happier if that makes you, if that gives you a reason. Yeah, what's BZ? Well, it's a chemical weapon. Now, I shouldn't describe it as a chemical weapon. The reason it's a chemical weapon is it was developed. It was developed. Now, I'm blanking on the synthesis site, but it was definitely developed in terms of investigating properties in Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland, maybe. Edgewood. Where was Edgewood? The whole point is that it was part of human experiments from for a period of time. Yeah, Maryland. This is in the U.S. Army, and it might have actually been used or manufactured in the Middle East, which is interesting. We don't have. I need to actually research to really know. There had been some talk about Hussein's government manufacturing it, and I think even the Assad government, Assad regime. I don't know that that's true, and I think a lot of the reports have been debunked. But the whole point is that it was a deliriant, and it kind of came about at a time when governments, including in the U.S., were very interested in using psychological drugs to incapacitate people, you know, setting aside trying to control minds like the CIA did. You know, they also, on the army side, were interested in just incapacitating people, you know, having a vapor of a drug and or just otherwise giving it to somebody and impacting them. Is there any drug that you do every day and or week? Sort of. And somebody might know what I'm talking about. But realistically, yeah, kind of. I do use matcha, my favorite drug of all time, even beating out salvia. I use that daily. I used it today. Do you think pharmacists can judge the interaction potential for 23 or 24 meds used daily? If you're legitimately on 23 or 24 meds, I am very sorry to hear that. That seems like a lot, but I know people with certain medical disorders can definitely get over a dozen. I would say, no, not maybe. Don't stop taking them, I guess, but that seems very difficult to actually judge the safety. How can I do Xanax without screwing up my life? Don't use too much, and don't use every day. Use it on occasion, preferably when you have anxiety or a specific reason to use, and stick to common doses. Don't combine with alcohol or other depressants. And otherwise, just be reasonable, really. Often harder to do than, you know, I make it sound. Is cocaine safe in small amounts? Yeah, it can be. Do a video on BZ. That would be so nice. Yeah, I will definitely cover it. It's sort of one of my just personal interests. And by the way, this is only tangentially connected, but I do recommend the movie Jacob's Ladder. It's cool. If you're into kind of horror and drug related horror, check it out. What is matcha? The question I never fail to receive. It's green tea made in a different way because you have the whole tea, the whole leaf ground up. Do you take any prescription medication? No. I've never really taken prescription medications outside of maybe antibiotics for a short period of time, and yeah, that's about it. I've never really been on prescriptions for anything. there's a possibility I should have at least had psychotherapy for a time uh, years ago. Not anymore. But no, never really went on any psychiatric medications. But I definitely recommend people do go on them in a large number of cases. Are there any conspiracy theories that you believe, or at least don't deny entirely? Oh, you would really have to actually start listing some conspiracy theories. Now, I will just say that I'm skeptical of a lot of government reports, but I would not say I'm typically a conspiracy theorist. I just don't have a tendency. I'm not going around, worried about chemtrails, if that's what you're asking. But hey, skepticism of authority is not bad, and it's good. Salvia daily, or did I mishear? No, I do not use salvia daily. Would you recommend trying ibogaine once? If you're really interested in using it, sure. Try and take a common dose, and don't use it if you have cardiovascular issues. Easier said than done, because you don't always know if you have cardiovascular issues, but there are some concerns. Just don't take too much, and try and use it in a clinic setting if you could, because they'll often be able to guide you into a safer use. I'm new here. Is the salvia favorite thing a joke? I have never heard anyone say that before. It's like DMT's super evil twin. Well, hey, that last part, I feel like that's a little bit harsh. Just saying. It's a joke, though, for the most part. Although I can't really say that. I mean, the person who said that pretty much knows my answers better than I do. So if that person says that's my favorite, then they're right. Why not? Do I enjoy tripping or having psychedelic experiences? I I do. They're interesting and fun. As I've said recently to some people, they're a little boring at this point if I'm not using them with other people, which I've not done regularly. Hopefully that'll change soon. But they're cool. They can be. A better question would be which theories, dealing with conspiracy theories, do I think are not true? Well, that's a ton. I don't think people are using fluoride to ruin the masses. I don't think. I'm not worried about GMOs, setting aside company practices. I'm not worried about chemtrails. I'm not. I don't think the earth is flat. I don't think the government is hiding aliens. So, you'd probably have to ask me some specific ones a little more. Yeah, I know, Ben. I've been going for a long period of time. Oh my, it's been an hour and a half. I blame a functional group. I really should not have done this. It's taking up all my time. But I don't mind. Scopolamine and Flocka, please don't use the term Flocka, uh, are harmless guys. I love them both. They make me feel so good. Well, hey, that's good for you. Have fun. Enjoy. I hear Flocka is a good way to enhance your religious capabilities. A lot of people in some parts of the world use Flocka before church. It's a little known fact. This was the best choice you ever made. Sure. Hey, I mean, you're the person that knows better than me. So yeah, sure. Best choice I've ever made. Ever. No doubt. Thoughts on 1P-LSD? I think it's basically the same as LSD. There are a few questions I get, basically every. Actually, before I get into that, there's one question I haven't really received so far, which I normally do, which is, Seth, is there a drug you would not use? Although I kind of did get that for. I take that back. I did get that. See, an hour and a half is a long time to go. Anyways, the other one I often get is 1P-LSD. Is it the same or safer or the same safety as LSD? And basically treat it as the same. Yeah, I know, Ben. Are you serious? People really use this horrible drug before church? Oh yeah. I mean, well, see the ethnopharmacologic use of Flocka, it kind of dates back to about 1850, and it was common in churches in Pennsylvania, and and it kind of spread out from the Quakers, and so there's this whole interesting history that deals with it, and interestingly, it replaced mephedrone, which had been used around the late 1700s in some parts of the U.S., mainly around Virginia. So the location and the drug changed, and I think it kind of varied between the specific kind of Christianity. I've not slept in over 24 hours and I'm more lucid than Seth. Yeah, that seems possible. I mean, once we get to about 11, 12, I'm delirious, totally out of it, probably seeing spiders. Out of all the research chemicals, what is the closest to MDMA? Well, some people find 6-APB is pretty nice. It'd be nice if that's true. And yeah, I mean, there's some others that definitely fall in the entactogen class. But I was having a conversation with well, I guess I won't spoil any of the podcasts, maybe. But I was having a podcast with somebody who is in this area, And the conclusion from them was that no drug really truly replicates the so-called magic of MDMA. Is MDMA bath salts? No. Now, bath salts, which is a terrible term for cathinones, have been sold as as MDMA, and so yeah, there's that. I'm so excited for these podcasts. Awesome! Can't wait to start putting them up. I'm really hoping that I have not actually led people to believe that Flocka was being used in Pennsylvania churches in the 1860s. If anybody actually thinks I meant that seriously, I'm just tired and having a fun time. What's the highest dose of LSD you would ever take? Well, who am I with? What am I doing? Those are important pieces of context. Have you read Borax's method to replicate the MDMA experience? Yeah, I have. I'm quite familiar with Borax's work, and although there are a lot of pieces of misinformation on Reddit, I would say Borax is a great part of the online drug and even in real life drug community. So I'm glad he's around. You gotta say how much LSD you would actually do. I You would be hard pressed unless I was just so bent on having some massive experience just for the sake of it. Uh, you'd be hard pressed to give me a reason to go over 300 or 400 micrograms, maybe five or something. And 300 is often sort of the level at which I think there's diminishing returns and an increased risk of just sending yourself to the hospital for no reason. Do people actually watch your videos? I'm not sure. See, my theory is that most of you are actually in my imagination, and there's actually a glitch on YouTube which just leads to fake comments and views. It seems possible, not totally sure. Borax does what and at what dose? Well, he, a person, provides knowledge on a regular basis. He's a moderator on Reddit drugs. Do you think MDMA would be one of the worst drugs to do every weekend because it really uses up your serotonin? Yeah, I would say there's no good reason to use MDMA on a weekly basis. And I would say the most reasonable yet somewhat frequent use of MDMA that you could justify in good settings, not the worst kind of setting, is once a month. Do you think that this life is real or is it all just a simulation? Going deep with that one. Gonna have some Elon Musk style conversations. I there's an argument to be made that on a probability basis, if we assume continued computer advancement and the ability to replicate worlds and the ability to replicate a sense of consciousness within those worlds, that the ability to have, done that previously or at another time, another species even, is high, and therefore, as Elon Musk and others say, the chance of being at base reality is low. Now, there are some flaws in that argument, and I'm not going to start living my life as though we're in a simulation anytime soon. But it's interesting to think about. Would you ever try opiates, so morphine, if that's what we're talking about? Sure, why not? If we're talking about opioids, I've already used kratom and I've used oxycodone. What kind of music are you into? Favorite artists? I listen to a fairly wide range of artists, typically electronic though, and I've played the same live set from Tiesto at Ultra probably 10 times in the past few weeks. And I'm sure somebody else out there agrees it was good. So that gives you some insight. However, I listen to a fairly wide range, even expanding beyond electronic. Do a lot of people get caught ordering research chemicals through the mail? By police? No. By parents? Friends? Family members? Yeah, maybe. But, yeah, it's not too common for people to get arrested for ordering research chemicals at personal quantities. Would you try meth? Definitely. What kind of playlist do you use before your trip, and do you use headphones? Yes to the latter part of the question, and it varies on the other part of the question. Sometimes it's just my usual electronic music. Sometimes it's more sort of ambient, like Tycho and other ambient artists. Why do we experience audio-visual hallucinations and higher doses of MDMA? Well, you are ultimately affecting serotonin receptors involved in the hallucinatory action of LSD and psychedelics. So that could be part of the reason. Have you ever been deeply depressed? No. I've had depression before. Um, Not deeply, though, in the sense of severe, major, severe depression. Would you try nutmeg? It doesn't interest me too much, but sure, I will. What's the best herbal ecstasy on the market? I think that's hopefully an entirely illegitimate question. Is 5-MeO DMT better than DMT? No. I mean, they provide different effects, and the experiences are pretty different. And yeah, I wouldn't say that it is better. Do you plan to do a video on darknet markets and best practices for purchases? Probably not guiding people through using the markets. However, I do plan on covering markets more, maybe as an overview, maybe in the form of podcasts. As I was saying earlier in the evening, I want to do an episode with Ross Ulbricht's family. He was the founder of Silk Road. Also, I'm going to wrap this up fairly soon. I was not planning on going for this long, and it turned out to be, wow, an hour and 48 so far. So, and thank you to those who have supported. I had a few people support on YouTube using the super chat system, which is awesome, and also a new Patreon supporter. So, thank you very much to everybody who is helping out. I really appreciate the support. Everything the Drug Classroom does is only supported by donations, no ads, no sponsors. So, if you like the content and want to help it continue, even $2 or $5 per month on Patreon, which the link is on screen, is very helpful, and I definitely appreciate it. How would you rank Shulgin, McKenna, and Lily? Actually, probably in that order. Where did you gain most of your knowledge? I primarily just gained it from self education, reading textbooks on pharmacology, just reading a lot of pharmacology papers, reading a lot of books on ethnopharmacology and drug history, and just becoming more familiar with drugs. So I've just tried to learn more over time, and because I don't have every answer and insight in the world, that's why I started the podcast, or part of the reason I started the podcast. So some of the people on the podcast coming up will be, I have a psychiatrist, I have a psychotherapist, I have people working in harm reduction, I have people working in drug policy, I have a doctor who's also a pharmacologist, and I have most likely a neuroscientist. So that'll be great. Hopefully you all like that content. Seth learns everything from me. True. Yeah. Ever been to Amsterdam? No, I have not. What do you think about the influence psychedelics have had on society? I would say significant in many ways, from the 1950s, 1960s, in terms of influencing the way that the government operated, influencing the way that people sort of thought about society and changed their position on where society should head, even if it wasn't always good. And if we go back further, psychedelics have influenced, most likely, in my opinion, some religions, and have also been important for South American spiritual traditions, and they still are. So I think psychedelics are very important and worth keeping in mind from that perspective. Hi, Seth. How are you tonight? I'm great. Hopefully, you are doing well yourself. Can I do heroin if I do it in moderation? The key, of course, is can you actually do it in moderation? And some people can, some people can't. Therefore, for the former group, yeah, sure. For the latter group, probably not. However, that is in the current context of prohibition. You could be using heroin on a daily basis in certain settings and using it in an entirely non-problematic way, or mostly non-problematic way. But that is when you can actually eliminate the acute harm potential. And you can't really do that when you're using a street setting for, getting and using heroin. So therefore you do have to be careful. And I may have a different viewpoint on heroin safety than other people, but that doesn't mean I think it is just totally safe for everybody to use. Would you consider doing any content regarding burros? Sure, I think there's a lot to say about Ginsburg and Burroughs and a variety of people from the 1950s and 1960s. So I'm sure I'll try to cover them, especially when I have more to share. I think that might be the kind of thing I cover sooner in podcast form than in video form. So higher serotonin levels is a good thing, or is it not? Well, we don't really know. So I don't think it's going to be just some uniform X amount of serotonin, X leads to X, Y, and Z. I think obviously it varies based upon genetics. It varies based upon the region of the brain in which you're actually discussing serotonergic activity. But I think if we're talking about, say, depression in a fairly simplistic way, I think there's evidence for both sides. I think there's evidence for excessive serotonin activity being an issue, actually underlying some depressive symptoms. But there's also evidence for the classical monoamine, sort of lack of monoamine activity system, or that mechanism. So I don't know. There's really evidence on both sides. I should really call this a night. We're approaching 2 hours, and that's much longer than I intended to go. Are these streams just random or scheduled? Well, I essentially go on the schedule provided to me by a functional group, and whatever that functional group says, I end up basically doing when it comes to the stream schedule, which ends up being fairly random. And there's also some input from Ben, so it's not really up to me. It's largely a joke, of course. Okay, I'm actually going to call it a night. I'm just going to end up going for all night, and as much as I know people would prefer me to do that, and maybe I will at some point, try and do another election night stream where I went for 6 or 7 hours, and it was just me rambling about the election for far too long. Anyways, I'm going to end it here, and I just want to reiterate, not to beat you over the head with, talk about funding for the Drug Classroom, but it really is the case that I enjoy doing this. I hope the Drug Classroom is providing useful information, and I want to do a lot more. That's why the podcasts are coming up, more video content, more content on the website. There's also going to be, hopefully, some educational videos on pharmacology and history, and I want to do some work inside of schools for improving school curricula, and also working with doing talks in schools, and also working with in-school counselors to provide some drug education and harm reduction information. So there is a lot that I hope TDC can do, and basically the only limiting factor is ultimately going to be funding, and there's not that much which is required, but there's no other source of funding for the Drug Classroom outside of donations. So if you want to support, consider doing so on Patreon, even just $2 or $5 or however much you want to give. It's greatly appreciated. I really can't overstate my appreciation for the supporters so far. There's also, you can also find other support methods on at Seth, no, not at Seth, at thedrugclassroom.com. That's my email. At thedrugclassroom.com/support for PayPal and Bitcoin. And if you really cannot support monetarily, even though that's necessary for it to work, sharing the content and just contributing to the community is greatly appreciated. And I appreciate even the existence of this community. It's really amazed me the fact that there's, about 50,000 people who are interested in drugs in this way, interested in harm reduction and education, and I hope TDC can continue to grow, and I really do appreciate the community and the support from all of you. It really is great to see, and I hope we get to continue doing more in the future. I will talk to you all fairly soon, and if you didn't get your question answered, email me at seth@thedrugclassroom.com. Good night to everybody.